RMS Empress of Ireland stood majestic and unshaken at the port of Quebec, her white hull gleaming under the soft hues of the late May sky. At 570 feet long and nearly 66 feet wide, she was an emblem of engineering and luxury, a jewel in the fleet of the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company. Passengers bustled along the gangway, bidding farewells, waving their handkerchiefs, and securing their belongings. The scent of sea salt and coal smoke mingled in the cool air as steam hissed from the towering funnels. Among the passengers was William McCrae, a seasoned journalist from Montreal, embarking on his first trip across the Atlantic in years. His notebook was already filled with half-written observations. The well-dressed businessmen, the families clutching excited children, the solemn-faced Salvation Army members embarking on missionary work. He tapped his pencil against the paper, watching as a steward helped a frail elderly woman into a deck chair. "First time sailing, sir?" a voice asked. William turned to find a man standing beside him, dressed in a fine dark suit with a crisp bow tie. His piercing blue eyes gleamed with curiosity. "No," William replied, shaking his head, "but first time on this fine vessel." "And yourself, Captain Kendall," the man said with a polite nod. "Henry Kendall. It's my first voyage as captain of the Empress, though I've served on her before." "An honor to meet you, Captain," William said, gripping the man's firm handshake. "Safe passage, I hope." Kendall's expression was unreadable for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the open water. "The St. Lawrence can be unpredictable this time of year, but she's a fine ship. We'll be in Liverpool before you know it." As the final whistle sounded, signaling departure, the Empress of Ireland eased away from the dock, her bow cutting smoothly through the calm waters. The shoreline of Quebec receded into the distance, and with it, the last vestiges of land before the vast, open Atlantic night had fallen over the St. Lawrence River, draping the world in a deep, inky darkness. The Empress of Ireland moved steadily along the water, her engines thrumming like the heartbeat of a giant. Most passengers had retired to their cabins, lulled by the gentle rocking of the ship. Others remained in the lounges, playing cards, sipping brandy, or discussing their plans upon arrival in England. William had found himself on deck, drawn to the crisp night air. The sky was a velvet black, pinpricked with stars, and the river stretched out in an unbroken shimmer. He leaned against the railing, lost in thought, until a thick wall of fog rolled in like a ghostly tide, swallowing everything in sight. "Fog's coming in fast," a voice muttered beside him. It was one of the ship's officers, his brow furrowed in concern. "Worst kind. You can't see anything until it's too late." William watched as the ship's lights dimmed into the haze. The world beyond. The deck had vanished entirely. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural blast of a foghorn, distant yet close enough to raise the hairs on William's arms. Captain Kendall was already on the bridge, his jaw set tight. He recognized the sound of another vessel. Close, too close. The Empress gave 3 short blasts of her whistle, signaling that she was stopping. A reply came, one long wail of a horn, but the thick fog made it impossible to tell where the ship was. Then, through the mist, the dark silhouette of the Norwegian collier Storstad emerged like an apparition. "Hard starboard," Kendall barked, his voice sharp with urgency. The crew scrambled, the ship lurching as they attempted to avoid disaster. But the Storstad was already upon them, A monstrous grinding crash split the night. Metal groaned as the Storstad's iron bow tore into the Empress's starboard side like a dagger slicing through flesh. The impact sent a violent tremor through the ship, throwing William off his feet. The air filled with the shrieks of twisting steel, the panicked shouts of passengers, and the gushing roar of water pouring into the hull. Chaos erupted as the ship began to list sharply to the starboard side. Passengers, jolted awake by the collision, stumbled into the corridors, half-dressed and disoriented. Some cried out for their loved ones, while others tried to make sense of what had happened. The ship was flooding at an alarming rate. William found himself amid the frenzy, trying to help where he could. He saw a mother clutching her 2 young children, their faces pale with fear. "This way," he urged, guiding them toward the deck. Above, Captain Kendall fought to maintain order. "To the lifeboats, stay calm," he called, but his voice barely rose above the clamor. The ship was sinking too fast. The Empress of Ireland had been designed with watertight compartments, but the gash from the Storstad had compromised too many of them. The starboard list made launching lifeboats nearly impossible. Some hung uselessly at odd angles, while others capsized as soon as they hit the water. Screams pierced the night as people fell into the freezing river, their cries swallowed by the dark waves. William grasped the railing as the deck tilted further. His fingers were numb with cold. The water was rising rapidly, filling the lower levels within minutes. Nearby, he saw a group of Salvation Army members clasped together, singing hymns even as the ship's stern lifted high into the air. With a terrible final groan, the Empress of Ireland gave in to the inevitable. She nosed downward, her stern rising in a steep arc. The last screams echoed across the water, before, with a thunderous roar, she vanished beneath the surface. Dawn broke over a desolate scene. The St. Lawrence River, so calm the day before, was now a graveyard of floating debris and struggling survivors. The Storstad still loomed nearby, her bow crumpled but afloat. The ship had survived the collision, but those aboard could only watch helplessly as hundreds of people were swallowed by the sea. Rescue boats scoured the water, pulling the lucky few from the frigid depths. William found himself among them, shivering violently as he gripped the wooden sides of a lifeboat. He had been fortunate, but as he looked around, the weight of tragedy settled heavily upon him. Of the 1,277 souls aboard the Empress of Ireland, only 465 had survived. The rest, men, women, and children, had perished in the icy waters within minutes of the collision. As he was lifted onto a rescue vessel, William looked back at the empty waves. The ship was gone, but echoes of her final moments lingered. He knew that the river would hold its secrets, whispering them only to those who dared to listen. The Empress of Ireland had vanished beneath the currents, but her story would endure, a ghostly reminder of how swiftly fate could turn, and how even the grandest vessels could be humbled by the sea. The rescue ship Eureka rocked gently on the cold waters of the St. Lawrence, its deck a tableau of exhaustion and sorrow. William McCrae sat huddled near the rail, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, his clothes still damp from the river. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what he had witnessed. He had survived the sinking of the Empress of Ireland, but the faces of those who had not stayed with him haunting the corners of his mind. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the morning sun cast pale light over the water. Bodies drifted in the current, bobbing like forgotten relics. Survivors draped in makeshift coverings moved like ghosts across the deck, whispering prayers or staring blankly into space. The smell of salt and smoke clung to the air, mingling with the distant sounds of search boats calling out for any last signs of life. William's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet approach of Captain Henry Kendall. The man had shed his officer's coat, his face lined with an exhaustion deeper than William's own. The burden of command weighed heavy on him. "You're lucky to be here," Kendall said, his voice rough. William looked up, his eyes shadowed. "Lucky?" Kendall exhaled sharply, gripping the rail. "If you want to call it that. We lost over 1,000 souls last night. If that damned fog hadn't been so thick." His words faltered, and he shook his head. "We sign up for this life knowing the risks, but nothing prepares you for." He gestured toward the vast open waters where the Empress had gone down. William nodded slowly. "I saw mothers trying to hold on to their children, men clinging to pieces of wood, praying for a miracle, and those hymns, those Salvation Army folks singing even as the ship went under. I'll never forget it." "Nor should you," Kendall said. "Their stories deserve to be told." William clenched his fingers around the blanket. "And what of the Storstad? Did she take any damage?" Kendall's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Her bow was torn up, but she's still afloat. Some say the collier should have maneuvered better, should have done more to avoid us, but we'll never know exactly how it happened. The inquiry will decide blame, but that won't bring back the dead." A shout from across the deck broke their conversation. Another survivor had been pulled from the wreckage, a man half drowned, coughing up water as rescuers hauled him aboard. William's breath caught in his throat. So many had perished in the freezing river, yet here was one more life snatched from death's grasp. Kendall patted William's shoulder. "You're a journalist, aren't you?" "Yes." "Then write about this. Tell the world what happened here. Don't let them forget." 2 days later, the survivors reached Quebec, where crowds had gathered along the docks in anxious silence. Families scanned the faces of those disembarking, searching desperately for loved ones. Some gasped in relief, while others collapsed in sobs, realizing the ones they waited for were not among the living. William stepped onto solid ground, feeling the weight of the tragedy settle deep in his chest. The world around him moved in slow motion. Grieving mothers clutched empty arms. Husbands stared into the distance, their eyes hollow. The city, once lively with the bustle of daily commerce, had been transformed into a place of mourning. At the edge of the docks, a woman dressed in mourning black caught William's attention. Her hands were clenched around a damp handkerchief, her gaze locked onto the river. He hesitated before approaching. "Miss," he said gently. The woman turned, her eyes red-rimmed but filled with a quiet resolve. "Did you sail on the Empress?" "I did," he said. "I was among the lucky ones." She inhaled sharply, nodding. "My brother was on that ship, a missionary. I prayed he'd be among the survivors. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, struggling to maintain her composure. William felt a pang of helplessness. What could he say to ease such grief? Instead, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notebook. What was his name? Daniel Carter. He was with the Salvation Army. The memory hit William like a blow. He recalled the voices singing as the ship was swallowed by the sea, the unwavering faith in their final moments. He swallowed hard. They were brave, your brother and his fellows. They sang even as the ship went down. He wouldn't have been alone. A fresh wave of tears welled in the woman's eyes, but she managed a small, grateful nod. Thank you for telling me. William wished he could say more, but words felt insufficient. As he watched her walk away, he realized that Kendall had been right. This story needed to be told, not just of the disaster itself, but of the people, the lives lost, the courage shown in the face of certain doom. Days later, William sat at his desk in Montreal, the tragedy still fresh in his mind. His notebook lay open before him, pages filled with hurried notes, sketches of faces he had seen in their final moments, scraps of dialogue whispered in the dark. He dipped his pen into ink, hesitated, then began to write. His words flowed onto the page, capturing the horror, the bravery, the sorrow. He wrote of Captain Kendall's fight to save his ship, of the Salvation Army's hymns, of the mothers who refused to let go of their children, even as the waters swallowed them whole. Hours passed, then days. The newspapers were already filled with accounts of the tragedy. But William's story was different. It was not just a report. It was a tribute, a monument of ink and paper for those who had perished. And though he knew the world would move on, that time would dull the pain. He swore that the Empress of Ireland would not be forgotten. As he placed the final period on the page, he leaned back, exhaling shakily. He had survived the wreck, but the memories would remain forever. And through his words, so too would the voices of those lost to the depths. The river had claimed the ship, but it would never claim their story.